It's been nice to be with you, and I appreciate those who've made the effort to come out. We couldn't have had a meeting without you. You know, sometimes you get into a church and people say, well, I can't come, but I'll be with you in spirit. Oh. Well, nothing worse than preaching to a whole bunch of spirits. Only one kind worse than that. That's the kind that says, I can't come, but I'll get your tapes. I'd charge him $50 a tape, brother. I really would. Let's read from the book of Ecclesiastes. I don't suppose there's a book in the Bible more misunderstood, a book more neglected than the book of Ecclesiastes. Written by Solomon in his old age, looking back over the wreckage of his life. Solomon wrote through 3 books that found their way into the Bible. He wrote a book when he was young and in love. We call it the Song of Solomon. It's a book about the only girl he couldn't have. She turned him down stone cold. I don't blame her. I mean, how would you feel, ladies, if the fellow was trying to court you, called you horse? That's what Solomon called this woman, a horse. How would you like this for a proposal? He said to her, I got 60 wives already. He said, I got another 80 women that I'm living with. Matter of fact, he said, to be quite honest, I got more women than I can count. You could be first. She turned him down. Don't blame her. Don't blame her a bit. So he wrote one book when he was young and in love, a book of romance. He wrote another book in his middle age when he was at the zenith of his intellectual powers, book of Proverbs, a book of rules. It's a book that some discerning people read a chapter every day of the book of Proverbs. Down to earth, common sense, spirit-inspired wisdom for avoiding the pitfalls of life. Too bad Solomon didn't take his own advice. I've just finished working my way through Proverbs. I spent a whole year working out the outline. And I must have spent a year, maybe a year and a half, working on the commentary. And I couldn't help but be impressed as I went through the book of Proverbs, how often Solomon addresses himself to his son. And how many, many Proverbs have to do with the fool. Well, you see, Solomon had a fool for a son. And he knew that. He knew that as soon as he was dead and his young son Rehoboam got on the throne of Israel, he'd throw it away. The whole empire that David had built up and Solomon had consolidated, Rehoboam would toss the whole thing away in 6 months. He had a fool for a son. But don't feel sorry for Solomon. I feel sorry for Rehoboam. Because Rehoboam had a fool for a father. You always think of the wisdom of Solomon. And no doubt in his early days, when he had that divine, godlike wisdom, he was extraordinary in his insights and his penetration into the issues of life. But he lived like a fool. In fact, Solomon's son, Rehoboam, was the son of a pagan woman, one of the pagan women that he married, an Ammonitess. No wonder he couldn't get any Bible through the young fellow's head. All the young fellow could say was, "What you are, speak so loudly I can't hear a word you say." But he wrote this book, and the Holy Spirit protected his thinking and overruled his thought life as he was writing this book of Proverbs, this book of rules and its divine wisdom for everyday living. He wrote one book when he was old, looking back over the shipwreck and the wreckage of his life, the book of Ecclesiastes. It's a wail of despair over a misspent life. The words of the preacher we read, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. Vanity of vanity. All is vanity. That's his text. You want to know where he got his text from? The prophet had been in to see him. You know, Solomon did more to destroy the kingdom of Israel than any other king who ever sat on the throne of David. By the time Solomon died, he had turned Jerusalem into Babylon. You could walk down through the streets of the city of Jerusalem and you could see a shrine here to Ashtart. You could see an altar there to Baal. You could see down in the valley of Tophet a dark and a dreadful altar, always burning with fire, to that horrible god Moloch. It was a horrible thing. It was an idol with a hollow belly, and they would put flaming cords of wood in there until that whole lap and belly of that idol glowed with a fiery glare, red hot. Then they take living children and put it on its lap. It's no wonder God tore Solomon's kingdom away. He said, if it wasn't for your father's sake, I'd do it right now. But for David's sake, I'll wait until you're dead. But I'm going to tear your kingdom in pieces. You want to know where he got his text? After God had smitten him in his conscience as an old man for the dreadful things he had done, the diabolical, wicked example he had set to his people. After God had so often met with him and revealed truth to him, to go after all these pagan gods, the vile, evil, wicked, filthy, disgusting gods of Canaan. And I see him. He's sitting in his palace library and he pulls down a book off the shelf and he's thumbing through the Hebrew hymn book written by his father David. He comes across what we would call today Psalm 39. He's reading the Psalm of David, and suddenly it's like a voice speaking to him out of the past, like the voice of his father speaking from across the great divide. Thou hast made my days as an handbreadth, and mine age is as nothing before thee. Verily every man at his best state is altogether vanity. Selah. When you find that word in the Psalms, it simply means there, what do you think of that? Vanity. And the Hebrew word that's translated vanity so often in the Old Testament, it just means emptiness. You could paraphrase it, chasing the wind. That's what Solomon did in his later years. He went about chasing the wind. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. I've spent my life chasing the wind. It's a wail of despair over a misspent life. The Danish people used to have a fable about a spider that came down from the lofty rafters of the barn on a single thread, and he came down, 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 and he anchored the thread to a window, corner of the window in the barn. And then from that long, long thread, that was the guy rope, and he weaved his web around that thread. He had chosen a very busy corner of the barn, and he waxed fat and prospered. One day in his prosperity, he was walking across his web, and he happened to notice this strand that reached up into the unseen. He had long since forgotten what it was. He couldn't see any sense to it. He thought it was just a stray strand, so he lifted up his hand and he snapped it. And instantly his whole world caved in. That's what Solomon did. When he was a young man, he established diplomatic relations with heaven. There was a strand in his life that reached up into the unseen. Then he waxed fat and prospered. And in his prosperity, he forgot the significance of that dimension of his life. He snapped it. And his world caved in. And when he was an old man, he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. And he wrote it mostly for young people. He wrote it to show us the folly of living a misspent life. In this book, he shows us the perspectives and the prospects of the worldly-minded person. What the person who lives solely for this world, what his perspectives are, what he looks out for, what he goes after, what he wants, and his prospects, what he can expect when it's all over. He tells us some of the things he had sought, some of the things he had seen, and some of the things he had studied. Now, as a young man going on into middle age, Solomon went in for everything, you see, under the sun. That's one of the more common expressions in the book. It gives us the viewpoint of the worldly-minded man. The worldly-minded man lives for everything that's under the sun. That is, he lives for what this world has to offer, and he has no thought at all for the next world. That never occurs to him. In telling us of some of the things that he had sought, first of all, Solomon tells us that he thought it would be a good idea, as a young man, to go into the world of thought. He wanted to become an intellectual. It seemed to him that that was the best thing to do with your life. become one of the world's great intellectuals. And so he did. And he was a very great success at it. He says, I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. He was famous already in his day for being the wisest man who ever lived. People came from the ends of the earth to listen to his lectures on psychology and natural history in the city of Jerusalem. Royalty came. Kings came. Queen of Sheba came all the way up the long reaches of the Nile, across the sands of Sinai, up into the hill country of Judah. And she came to try him with hard questions. And when she went away, she said, the half was never told me. He's greater than anybody I could have ever imagined. And when Solomon had achieved as an intellectual, had achieved success in the world of thought, had become the greatest intellectual of his day, he said, I perceived that this also is vexation of spirit. In other words, he discovered what so many others have discovered, that you do not find happiness and lasting satisfaction and ultimate fulfillment just by becoming an intellectual. A man can have a dozen PhDs and not only be thoroughly miserable, but in his personal life be an arrant fool. Having tried the world of thought, Solomon decided to have a change. He went in for the world of thrills, decided to become a playboy, to live it up, to have fun, have a good time. He says, I said in mine heart, now I will prove thee with mirth, therefore enjoy pleasure. He went in for every kind of pleasure that man could imagine or devise. Everything. He abandoned himself to the gratification of the lusts of the flesh. His harem was enormous, his resources were boundless, his revelry was unstinted and unrestrained. If you'd gone past the royal palace in Jerusalem in those days, when Solomon was going in for the world of thrills, you could have heard the beat of the music, you could have seen the dancing on the palace lawns, you could have seen the shameful things that went on afterward. There wasn't anything along the line of sensual pleasure Solomon didn't try. Until at last he was utterly satiated, saturated, sodden through and through with every carnal pleasure that the mind of man could devise. And when he tried it all, he said, behold, this also is vanity. I said of laughter, it's mad. I take it, you know, that at that stage in his life, going in for the world of thrills, Solomon almost went over the edge into insanity. Except for the fact that just before he went right over, and many a person's gone over into the realm of insanity by indulging the pleasures of this world. get hooked on some horrible chemical substance, become an addict, until finally they go insane. Solomon tried that. Just before he went mad, he pulled himself together. He realized that the answer to life was not found in the world of thought, and it certainly wasn't found in the world of thrills. Then he decided that he'd go in for the world of things, and he became a businessman. He became a mercantile prince. He founded a great commercial empire. His caravans went across the Fertile Crescent down into the exotic markets of the distant east. His great Tarshish ships plowed the oceans of the world. And the wealth of the world began to stream into his warehouses in Jerusalem. He had the Midas touch. Everything he touched turned to gold. He was tremendously successful as a mercantile prince. In fact, he was so rich. He had so much of everything. The very pots and pans in his kitchen were made of gold. He had everything. He had 10 of everything, 20 of everything. When he had achieved success in the world of things and had everything that could be imagined, he said, I hated life. I hated life. In fact, it would seem as you read the thought behind the statement that Solomon at this stage in his career actually contemplated committing suicide. These were some of the things that he had sought. These are the very things that our society today teaches our young people to seek. We send our kids off to school, and what are they taught? They're taught to go in for the world of thought. All about them, it's presented to them, the world of thrill. By the time they're 18, they've tried everything. Nothing left to discover. Already sodden and saturated with sin. And they're taught to go in for the world of thought and the world of thrills and the world of things. There's no answer there. When you've got it all, when you've tried it all, you'll be empty and disillusioned and ready to put an end to it. These things are not big enough to satisfy the deepest hungers and longings of the human heart. Having told us some of the things he had sought, he tells us some of the things that he had seen. Because Solomon kept his eyes open as he journeyed through life. It occurred to him that maybe somebody else had seen something that he had missed. And he kept his eyes open. He looked around to see if somebody else had found the answer to life under the sun, to a life bounded by the horizons of time and sense. When I first came to North America, I was with a very large Canadian bank. I had joined the bank in London, and they'd sent me to Canada, across the entire length of the country to the province of British Columbia, then on up into the interior. And there my wife and I met quite a number of people in the lumber business, a very, very successful men, some of them in business. We made friends amongst these lumbermen. And I remember on one occasion, one of these men invited my wife and I out to his home for a meal one Saturday night, and we went out to his house. He had a lovely log cabin on the edge of the bush. We went in and sat down in his living room. And I happened to notice on the wall across from where I was sitting a most peculiar picture. It was a picture of a grinning human skull. I thought to myself, what on earth would possess a man in his right mind to put a human skull on his living room wall? It was a horrible thing. Didn't matter where you looked, you kept on looking right back at it, and it just hung there and gibbered at you. Well, by and by his wife came in and announced that the meal was ready, and people got up and trooped off into the dining room, and I hung behind for a minute to go and take a closer look at this picture. When I got up close to it, to my astonishment, it wasn't a picture of a human skull at all. It was an old-fashioned pen and ink drawing. The artist had depicted a woman sitting in front of a vanity mirror. It was an old-fashioned picture. The mirror was round like that. In front of her she had some jars and things, for improving on nature. And she had just finished piling all her thick black hair up on top of her head. And she was a nice-looking lady, and she had done a good job on herself. And she was admiring the end result in the mirror. And it was, when you got up, it was quite an attractive picture. But when I started to step back from the picture, something strange happened. The different pieces began to merge back into one. The round mirror became the dome of the skull. The black hair and its reflection became the empty eye socket. The jars became the grinning teeth. So that by the time I got back halfway across the room, it was once again a skull. You couldn't see the different parts, you could just see the skull. And underneath, the artist had written one word: vanity. Vanity. It is this concept, you see, of death, writing the word vanity over everything under the sun, that characterizes Solomon's theme in the second part of his sermon. The things that he had seen. He tells us of the vanity, the emptiness, that you're just chasing the wind, the vanity of time without eternity, of a new leaf without a new life, of mortality without immortality, of might without right, of prosperity without posterity, of religion without reality, of wealth without health, of life without length. For instance, in the first one, he tells us the vanity of time without eternity. And it's quite obvious that he was super organized. Tells us he had a time and a place for everything. Time for this and a time for that. Solomon was obviously not going to let one single moment of time escape him. Every single passing moment as it touched his life was going to contribute something to his life. He's going to make sure about that. He's going to live a full life, live it to the very, very full. Wasn't going to waste a single minute. But he says, as he lists all these things, nevertheless, he says, you've got a time for this and a time for that and a time for the other. But God has set eternity in your heart. What on earth is the use of time when you have actually been engineered for eternity? Time isn't big enough when you really want to live forever. And there's death waiting down a few short years of time to carry you away into your tomb. One of the greatest preachers ever to come out of Scotland was a man by the name of Thomas Chalmers. When he was a young man, he was a pastor. He wasn't even saved, didn't know the Lord, never had a saving experience with Christ, but he was an ordained clergyman. And he really wanted to be a professor of mathematics in the University of Edinburgh. He wrote a little pamphlet. He was very clever, but he wasn't saved. He wrote this little pamphlet that said that he had proved by personal experience that a pastor could discharge all his obligations in 3 days, leaving him the rest of the week to pursue any hobby he liked. And what he really wanted to be was a professor of mathematics. That's what he did with the rest of his time. And then came his conversion and his spectacular ministry. God anointed and God blessed. When he was an old man, Thomas Chalmers was attending a meeting of the synod of his church. Many other his colleagues in the ministry were there. There was one man who didn't like him, who was jealous of him. And this man had dug up somewhere this pamphlet that Chalmers had written in his old unregenerate days. And he stood up in front of all the assembled ministers of the synod, and he began to read this pamphlet to them. And then he turned to Chalmers and he said, "Tell me, sir, did you write this?" Chalmers turned on him. "Oh, yes, sir," he said, "I wrote it. Strangely blinded as I was, I wrote it. In those days, sir," he said, "I aspired to be a professor of mathematics in the University of Edinburgh. But, sir," he said, "what is mathematics? It is magnitude and the proportion of magnitude. And in those days, sir, I had forgotten 2 magnitudes. I had forgotten the shortness of time, and I had forgotten the length of eternity." That's what Solomon did. He forgot the shortness of time. He forgot the length of eternity till he was an old man. And now all he could do was look back at a wasted life. Some of the things he had solved, some of the things he had seen, some of the things he had studied. He became more and more obsessed with the fact of death. "Why shouldest thou die," he says, "before thy time? A living dog," he says, "is better than a dead lion." And here's a classic error, common enough to the person who lives only for this world. The dead, he says, know not anything. That's not true. Just read Luke chapter 16 to find that out. The dead know a whole lot. But that's what the ungodly man thinks. That's what the materialistically minded person thinks, that the dead know not anything, that when you're dead, you're dead. When you're dead, you're not dead, my friend. You're still very much alive. All you've done is change your residence. And you've heard of the expression, the fly in the ointment? Comes right out of the book of Ecclesiastes. It's a dead fly. Because that's the fly in the ointment. Doesn't matter what you do. Doesn't matter where you go. It doesn't matter how long you live. It doesn't matter how successful you are. The fly in the ointment is that you're going to die. And to die, having lived for the wrong world. It's no wonder that in his summary at the end of the sermon, Solomon addresses himself to young people. And he tells them in chapter 11, and again in chapter 12. In effect, he says, young people, listen, young people, don't make my mistake. Don't do what I did. When life was before me, I threw it away and lived for the wrong world. Now I'm an old man, and I've wasted my life. And I've got to go and meet God and explain to him why I wasted my life. I never think of Solomon in his old age writing this sad book without thinking of the great apostle Paul. He's writing to his friends at Philippi. He's sitting in prison. He's chained to a Roman soldier. He has been charged with high treason. Falsely, but nevertheless, a terrible charge to hang over a man's head in the days of Nero. He doesn't know yet whether he's going to live or die. He has a feeling that he might get off, but he doesn't know for sure. Quite possible that before ever this letter gets to Philippi, he'll be dead. That the executioner's axe will sever his head from his body. But he's looking back, and he can think of tens of thousands of men and women, boys and girls, and young people who are going to be in heaven because one day they met a man by the name of Paul. He's thinking of country after country, city after city, community after community that he has personally evangelized. He could say to the people, the elders at Ephesus, that he had personally knocked on every door, that he had stood by every sickbed, he had visited in every jail, that he was clear of the blood of all men. Wasn't a man, woman, boy, or girl in Ephesus to whom he hadn't spoken about Christ. And he was thinking of churches he'd left behind him in every major city of the Roman Empire in southern Europe and Asia Minor. And he can think of hundreds upon hundreds of young men, keen, bright young men, dedicated, gifted young men who are out blazing gospel trails to the ends of the earth because one day their lives were impacted by a spirit-filled man by the name of Paul. He's writing to his friends at Philippi. And this is what he says. For to me, to live is Christ. And to die is gain. How do you want to finish? Do you want to finish like Solomon or like Paul? It all depends